Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight, we are going places very remote, so I hope you have your camping gear ready, as you're in for a long night. Get comfortable, and let the darkness take control. When I was a junior in college, I went camping with 4 friends in Bald Eagle State Park in Pennsylvania. We had reserved a campsite that was pretty remote, pretty deep in the park, way up on one of the mountains, not near any of the other campsites. It was located at the end of a narrow dirt road, maybe about 75 feet long, which itself broke off from the main road, which I think was also dirt. There was nothing at the end of that little road except our campsite. We parked at the entrance to the park and spent the day hiking up the site, setting up camp, and then hiking around. We made a fire, made dinner, and turned in. Not long afterwards, we discovered that one of the guys with us snored loudly, like the walls of the tents began to shake snores. Truly deafening stuff. After probably an hour or hour and a half, the rest of us gave up on trying to sleep and climbed out of our tents, leaving our loud friend snoring away in his. My friend at the time was a DJ for our school radio station, and she had a late night show. I think she was on between midnight and 2 a.m. Since we couldn't sleep, we trekked up the main road where the reception was better and where we could actually be able to hear the radio over the snores. When we got to the road, we stood in a loose circle near the entrance to the site. As soon as we stood there, a black pickup truck with its lights off appeared out of the woods and passed by us, very slowly. It was unmarked, not a ranger. We listened to the radio for maybe half an hour or 45 minutes after that, and even briefly called in to say hi. Finally though, we decided to head back to bed. One of the girls went off into the woods to take care of some things while I climbed back into the tent I shared with her and got into my bag. After a couple of minutes, I heard her move through the leaves towards the tent, coming from my right. At the same time, I also heard the unmistakable rumble of tires on the ground. I stood up and looked out of the little screen window of the tent. We hadn't bothered to put up the rain fly, as it was a perfectly clear night with a very bright moon, so I could see everything. I saw my friend come sprinting back to the tent and ducking behind it as the black truck pulled into our campsite, still with its headlights off and just shut off its engine. Our friend is still snoring. I have a little knife in my tent, and I know my 2 other friends have at least one in theirs, but we have no other weapons, no guns, no bear spray, so we just watch. As I said, it was a clear night, and we can see the truck just fine. It's maybe 20 feet away from my tent, but I can't see who's in the truck, or how many people there are. Nothing seems to move inside the truck. I still remember the metallic clunk sound as the engine cools off. I honestly have no idea how long I just watched it. My friend had ducked down behind our tent, and I could hear her breathing that she was terrified, but neither of us said a word. It feels like a really long time went by. It had to have been at least 10 minutes, but could have been half hour or more. We just kept waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. Eventually the truck started again, and then backed up down the long, narrow dirt road. It never turned its headlights on. I heard it drive back in the direction it had originally come from, and that was it. My friend burst into the tent a second later, Now we're all talking. Did you see that? Holy crap. But our friend is still asleep. Eventually we just went to bed. We packed up and headed out in the morning as we planned. And yes, we checked with the park. They did not own any black unmarked SUVs, nor did a ranger come to check on our site in the night. This happened during the summer of 2012, when I was 15 and still an active member of a local Boy Scouts troop. I went camping, something my troop had frequently done. The camp we chose was for a full weekend. It was a nice forested area with taller grass. It also lacked other campers, and we saw no cars driving in or out throughout the time we spent there. Since we did not have to worry about other campers, our troop had a big campfire on Saturday night that went late into the night. Eventually, our campfire started to die out, prompting us to put it out and respectively hit the hay. Oddly for me, I was unable to sleep that night. I usually slept well on campouts, especially when I have the pleasure of using a tent alone, like I had done on this occasion. So I sat there in complete silence, listening to the various sounds around my tent. Eventually I found myself dozing off, until I heard something walk nearby our campsite. There was a very apparent rustling of grass that began to get closer and closer to the blob tents that our boys were sleeping in. After a solid minute of movement, the sound stopped right in front of a tent that was about 7 or so feet from mine. I then heard the rustling start up again and head off in the direction of the forest. I was paralyzed with fear. What could have made the sound? I thought about it for a few solid minutes and eventually decided it must have been an adult checking on us. Before I went to sleep, I looked out the tent little mesh window at my side and did not see anything out of the ordinary in our campsite. This sound went on a bit into the distance, but I did not record for how long, as I eventually fell asleep. I woke up later that night to the same sound of rustling, yet this time it was closer to our tent circle, as it was the first time I heard it. While I did not think about this too much, I silently listened to the sound to see where it was heading, and once again went to the same area it did the first time. Being curious, I peered through the tent window to see what was making the noise. My face turned white, and I couldn't move. My mind was still trying to register what was going on. I saw a large, black figure standing before the tent in the darkness, and it was clear it was not a scout, as the figure had no flashlight on it, and it was far too large to be any boy in our troop. Suddenly, the figure inched their hand to the tent door and began to slowly unzip it. After what felt like several minutes, the figure seemed to poke their head into the tent. Immediately after, a deafening scream came from that tent. I heard other tents being unzipped and saw lights being flashed at the one tent, as well as the black figure starting to run away from the tent. Within seconds, the figure was running out of view from the tree line. A few adults in the adult camp came to see the commotion. The boys who were in the tent told what they had experienced, and several boys mentioned that they heard the sound of rustling in the grass around our tents throughout the night. Unfortunately, none of the boys were able to get a clear view of the person, except that the figure looked like a man wearing dark clothing. Disturbed, the adults had us moved to the campsite where they were staying at, and 2 adults volunteered to stay awake for the rest of the night, in case the creep returned. The next morning we quickly packed up our stuff and left as soon as possible. We warned the ranger in charge, who called the local sheriff. From what I know, the person was never caught, and our troop never camped there again. It was easily one of the most frightening experiences, and something I would always remember when I went camping during my time as a Boy Scout. My husband and I went camping for the first time ever in Arizona, as part of our long trip out west. I had picked out this really cool place that was on a mountain overlooking a beautiful landscape. It's next to a cliff and in a really isolated location. I'm talking about 20 miles of gravel roads in the middle of a national forest. So we get there and set up our tents and hike a little bit and take pictures of the surrounding area. We see a few cars parked around 2 tents and decide to stop and talk to the other campers nearby, because we had heard that there was going to be a bad storm that night. These were 4 guys who were from Arizona, and they told us not to worry and that the storm didn't get that terrible around this area. That was all the persuasion that we needed to stay. Later on, while walking a bit further down the campsite, we see a woman with her dog and another older lady. We smile and wave and continue to hike down a bit further into the forest. Let me elaborate that because of the storm, we are one among maybe a total of 7 campers that decided to stay and withstand the night. We watch the sunset when we get back to our site and make sure our car was only a few yards away, and go into our tent when it gets too dark to see. There are no stars tonight due to the storm clouds, and it hasn't begun to rain yet, so we decide to try and sleep right away so that we could possibly sleep through the storm when it does hit. It is an insanely windy night, so it is hard to sleep, but eventually we get a bit of shut-eye. I wake up at 10:30 p.m. to the sound of some crazy thunder rolling through the mountains and rain hitting down on our tent. I'm a little freaked out because they get a lot of flash floods out here, and I didn't want to fall off the side of the cliff, but I tell myself to try and sleep, and eventually I doze off again. It's 12 a.m. and I wake up once more. This time because I hear something heavy hitting the side of our tent. Like full-on sound, like someone could have been punching our tent and sliding something down the side of it. I opened my eyes and couldn't see anything. It was completely dark, no light whatsoever. This sound continued every couple of minutes, and it was at this point that I was soiling myself. Suddenly, I hear footsteps right next to my side of the tent. They are slow, but steady. I feel my entire body freeze up. I seriously start thinking about how this is it, and I'm about to die. My heart is beating so fast that I am certain whatever is out there can hear it. Then, whatever it is, lets out a deep sigh right on the opposite side of the tent. I'm thinking it's a bear, and realizing that I might actually have to face this thing. In a desperate call for my husband's mind-reading powers, I squeeze his hand really repetitively and he wakes up. But instead of reading my mind, he blurts out, "What's wrong? Why are you squeezing my hand?" Right as he says this, the footsteps stop. I don't hear the footsteps again. So after a while, I break out of my frozen state and tell him what I'd heard. We decide it may have been an animal passing by, but whatever is hitting our tent continues every so often, and I'm starting to go a little insane from this night, wondering what's going on. We convince ourselves that it's just pines falling from trees above us and try to sleep again. We just need to make it through one night, and then we can laugh about it in the morning. A couple of minutes go by, and suddenly the tent caves in on my husband's side, right on his head. He whispers that it feels like something is pushing the tent, and I feel my heart instantly sink. I'm freaking out, thinking it's a bear that just sat on his head. But he decides to push back, and we hear the familiar noise of something sliding off our tent that we've been hearing for the past few hours. And then we realize that it's been snowing outside, and the noise we were hearing was heavy ice falling from the trees onto our tent. Our tent is covered in thick ice, and my husband pushes the tent from the inside until all of the ice slides off. Still determined to make it through the night, and a little relieved that it was just ice and not a bear, we try to sleep and make it to sunrise. We keep on a small light that my husband had luckily brought with him just to calm us down a little. Things are starting to seem normal again. We both close our eyes. It's 3 a.m. at this point, not even 30 minutes after we had settled down. My literal worst nightmare happens. Out of the pitch black night, we hear a woman screaming. We distinctly hear her say, "What the hell? Oh my God!" followed by some other non-tangible words that sound a lot like help. The way that she screamed didn't sound like anger. It sounded like terror and a sense of pure panic. My husband and I are both frozen looking for each other. I quickly shut off our light and start panicking and asking what we should do because, what the hell, how is this really happening now? While we are trying to decide what to do for the next few minutes, we hear her again. But this time she is screaming, "No, no, 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 no," as we hear a car speed off into the night. I'm in tears at this point. We have no idea what's happening. It's dead silent now, save for the icy rain hitting our tent. It definitely sounded like she wasn't in the car, but more like she was desperately yelling or begging not to be hurt. And this was the breaking point. Because I could take the bad weather. I could take the possible bear outside my tent. I could even take ice falling on our heads in one of the warmest states of America. But this thing, I cannot and will not be ever able to handle. A screaming person in the middle of the pitch black woods at 3 a.m? We decide to get out of there, and even contemplate leaving our tent and booking it to the car. But instead we try to stay level-headed, grab our valuables and put them in the car first. We frantically gather our things and stay close as we shuffle into the car. I close the doors and keep the lights off for a while, scared to attract unwelcome visitors. And while my husband goes back to grab the tent, I dial for 911. I tell them what I'd heard, where we were, and they say that they're sending someone to the campsite to make sure everything's alright. Only thing is, we are literally in the middle of nowhere, and it will definitely take them more than an hour to arrive. Not to mention the storm left those gravel roads in some pretty terrible conditions. So my husband and I decide to start driving, and it's about 3:30 a.m. As we drive out of the campsite, my husband notices one last eerie detail that stuck with me. The 4 guys that we had talked to earlier had left. All 3 of their cars had gone, while their tents remained. Whatever scared them off, they sure left in a hurry. It was only after we started driving that the thought occurred to me. Whatever was walking next to my tent may not have been an animal. It could very well have been someone lurking around in the dark, who decided to go after the girl we had seen previously on our hike. I'm not quite sure what went down on that lone mountain that night, and I hope that everyone got out there okay. I called the police department back to follow up, and was told that the cops searched the area for a few hours, talked with a few people who were still there, but didn't find anything. This happened to me just a few days ago. My wife and I were backcountry camping in Redwoods National Park in California, and as we went to sleep, a heavy fog rolled in. I was sleeping soundly in the tent, but at around 3 a.m, I woke up suddenly with a sense that something was outside the tent. I heard the sound of light, muffled footsteps, and a quiet hissing or whispering sound, almost like something was muttering to itself. Assuming it was a bear or raccoon, I gently unzipped the rain fly of my tent and looked out. As soon as I opened the tent, the muttering sound ceased. The fog was so thick, I could barely see more than 15 feet away. The moon and the night sky weren't visible at all. I turned on my headlamp to get a better look, and in the distance I see a faint light turn on as well. At first, I thought it might be another hiker, although we were about 15 miles out and in the backcountry. But it was a yellowish/orange flickering light only a couple of feet off the ground. I see a silhouette of a humanoid shape that almost looks like it's beckoning to me. I grab my knife, get out of my sleeping bag, and walk into the night. As I approached the light, I could see the humanoid shape more and more clearly, but I started to get really unnerved. It doesn't move, it doesn't make any noise. Who or what would be out here at 3 a.m. 15 miles into the woods? I turned once to look back at my tent, and when I turned back around, the light was gone. The next morning we searched the area where I saw the light, but we didn't see any tracks. The thing that scared me the most, though, is that right near where the light was, there was a 50-foot cliff leading into the stream below. I do a lot of hiking and mountain biking in the woods. Nothing has ever made me not want to go back there, but there has been some weird stuff. First, there's a lot of weird stuff in the woods. Teepees, altars, liantos, shrines. Some of it is pretty creepy, but I think most of it is just built by bored people who are trying to make something creepy so that it makes it a bit less scary. Among the strangest of the things that I've seen are a large clearing of trees, with all but one entrance blocked off by webs of red strings stretched across the clearing, at least 30 feet in diameter. A wooden tunnel leading to a small room containing defaced religious icons, Buddha statues, crucifixes, Stars of Davids, and dozens/hundreds of creepy Polaroid pictures hanging from the ceiling. Ones I remember include a close-up face shot of a girl sleeping, a dude brushing his teeth taken from outside the window, and a photo booth strip of two girls where one of their faces are crossed out, and it says, "I'm glad you're dead," written with one word on each picture, and a number of weird little shrines with creepy scriptures printed or scrawled into them. But what's a lot scarier to me is the stuff that isn't meant to be creepy, like the aforementioned things hopefully are. I once heard a distant panicked scream, followed by a crashing/thudding sound. I couldn't tell from which direction it came from, and I didn't hear anything else, so I have no idea what it was. I think the creepiest thing I've experienced was one time while walking home from school through the woods. I heard people talking in the distance, and I couldn't hear what they were saying, but they seemed to be arguing. They were quiet for a minute, and then I heard them again, really close now. The forest was really dense here, so although they sounded maybe 15 to 20 feet away, I couldn't see them or pinpoint exactly where they were. This time, I could hear what they said. Guy number 1. "It's messed up, man. You always make me shh. Someone's coming. Crap." From a bit further away to my left than the other guys, who sounded mostly to the right in front of me, another guy goes, "Hurry. Shit. Shh." I came around the corner and expected to see them, but I couldn't see anyone. I kept walking, cautious and trying to be aware of my surroundings. About 10 feet past the corner, I saw something to the left of the trail, close to where the voices were coming from, and caught my eye. It was a bunch of stuff wrapped in a big tarp. It wasn't completely wrapped up, and you could kind of see into it. All I could see was something glass, and I wanted to see what it was. I scanned the forest behind the tarp to make sure no one was watching, and then stepped towards it. Suddenly, one of them says, "Keep walking," very calmly. I looked back into the forest, but still couldn't see anyone. They said, "Go," still calm. I looked for another second, unable to see a soul, and then turned and kept walking like nothing happened. I don't know what was going on there, but the whole time it gave me the creepiest vibe I've ever gotten. In 2007, I was a freshman going on sophomore in college, and my brother Martin was still in high school. We have two much younger siblings, so at the time, they were around elementary school age. My parents decided to take a cruise for their 20th wedding anniversary that year. So my brother and I were voluntold to watch my younger brother and sister, Cole and Charlotte. My brother's best friend, Christian, stayed with us while my parents were gone, and he helped us plan fun activities for the younger siblings. One idea they were particularly excited about was a camping trip, as my family had never been particularly outdoorsy in the past. Their eyes lit up at the prospect of cooking our dinner on an open campfire and fishing in the stream. Since it was early summertime, we had the great luck of warm but not too hot weather and beautiful clear skies for stargazing. Finally, we packed and readied for the somewhat long drive to the mountains. We checked into our campsite before dark, and Cole and Charlotte helped us to set up the tent. It was strange, but there were no other people at the campground, which was unusual for this time of year. Once we finished dinner, the young brother and sister were ready for sleep, so Martin, Christian and I stayed awake a little longer, catching up and getting things ready for the next morning. Suddenly, a white Astrovan pulled up into the camping spot directly next to ours. He had dozens to choose from, but he chose to park right next to us. "Oh well," Christian said, "at least we have company now." He called out a quick hello to the new neighbor, but received no reply. I got an uneasy feeling almost immediately, but decided to push it aside and continue to get the fishing poles ready for the morning, and put the food away for the night to ward off bears and wild animals. Over the next hours or so, things started to get weird. The man parked next to us got out of his van to sit at the picnic table with only a small fire. From our roaring fire, I could see that he was looking directly at us. However, his fire died out completely several minutes later, and he just continued to sit there. I could feel him staring, but I couldn't see his face anymore. He was just sitting there, breathing. Christian and Martin noticed that I was uneasy, and they picked up on how creepy the situation had started to become. Martin whispered, "Why is he breathing like that? I don't feel safe anymore." I told Christian and Martin that I was going to stay awake, because I didn't trust that guy. As soon as they moved from the fire into their tents, the man rose from the picnic table and started moving towards us. I called out hello and received no response from him. Finally, in a whim of panic, I demanded that we pack up and get home immediately. Christian and Martin got out of the tents and saw the figure of the man just standing there staring at us, breathing hard. We tried to stay quiet and calm as possible while we packed up most of our things and not to alarm Cole and Charlotte, finally throwing everything in the trunk. We drove away and didn't look back. Before leaving the site itself, I asked if we could go to the check-in area at the lodge to see what the hell was going on and see if they knew anything more. What was the guy's deal? But to my surprise, there was no one else registered at the camping site that evening. The story doesn't end there though. About 6 months later, I was in my sophomore year of school when a local hiker went missing in a county over from where we camped and where I went to college. She was doing something so normal, hiking with her dog. Sadly, she turned up several months later, murdered and found in a white Astro van. When the news finally released photos of the van and the man's face, I knew it was him. I got a phone call from my brother and his friend, and they recognized him too. We came to find out that it wasn't his first murder several years later, and he became known as the National Forest Serial Killer. I sincerely mean it when I say that I am incredibly cautious when I'm camping now because of this encounter. Thinking that it could have been us or my younger siblings still gives me nightmares to this day. We recently had a reunion, Christian, Martin and I, and we talked about what happened to us with more than 10 years gone. It's amazing we all still remember the details, as they are etched into our memories forever. In September this year, I was hunting antelope out near the Red Desert in Wyoming. I had just shot my antelope and was walking about 150 yards out to where it had dropped, so I could tag and begin field dressing the animal. I should mention I'm about 40 miles from the main road, and that I had not seen another human or vehicle since I got off the main road. This area is extremely remote. It's hard to even describe. So as I'm walking out to the antelope, I look up, and about 1 to 2 miles off in the distance, I see this extremely bright light zooming over the landscape and heading my way. I thought it was probably a game warden on a side-by-side coming to check my paperwork and all. No big deal. I keep walking out and find the animal and look up, and this light drives down into the sagebrush and I can no longer see it. It was about half a mile from me when it disappeared. I also notice I don't hear any engine, if it is in fact someone on a motorized vehicle. I'm mostly confused at this point, not sure what the hell this light is, or where it went, but I continue on and tag the antelope. It takes me all of 10 to 15 seconds to put the tag on. Then I look up and see the light traveling away from me. It's now about 3 to 5 miles away from me and going at least 100 miles an hour. It was really zooming way faster than any vehicle could travel over that type of terrain. Also, there are no roads or anything where the light is traveling, so I don't know how it was going so fast. I'm pretty spooked at this point. I field dress the animals as fast as I can and drag it back to my truck. I just had a very uneasy feeling at this point. I have no idea what that light was, although some others have speculated that it was a drone. But if it was a drone operated by the game warden, why did he come to check me out once I got back to the truck? I am from Finland, and that's also where the things I'm about to describe to you happened. This was some years ago, pre-smartphone/GPS era. It was at the end of summer, and myself and 2 friends were on a camping trip up in the north in Lapland. The mosquito season was over, and the weather was cooling down in anticipation of the coming fall. The 3 of us had packed food and gear for a 10-day trek. The car we arrived in had been left at the parking lot of a visitor center, and this happened within the premises of the Urko-Kekkonen National Park, a 985 square mile stretch of wilderness near the Russian border. The terrain there varies greatly from treeless and semi-mountainous to dense forest of spruce and pine and dwarf birch. There are lots of swamps. Seeing reindeer is not uncommon, and some nights you might hear wolves in the distance. You can run into a bear or wolverine in this place, but of course normally they avoid people. We mostly camped in a tent, but some nights we used shelters and simple huts provided for travellers free of charge. The trip had lasted 5 days, and we were at the furthest of any kind of civilization we were going to be on during that particular outing. Truly in the middle of nowhere. There really is nothing there. There are no villages, towns, or industries. The place is a national park after all. Seeing other hikers happened from time to time. You'd see some people in the distance, maybe. Very rarely you may even come face to face with them. So in the middle of our trip, we were camping in a small clearing. Woodland extended around us for a considerable distance in all directions. It was already dark. We had eaten our evening meal, and all 3 of us were jammed into our only tent. It was a bit cramped, but we fit. We took turns carrying it during the hikes. We were just exchanging some jokes and crude humour in the dark, like guys in their 20s do. Right before we were about to go to sleep in our sleeping bags. When we quieted down, we began to hear it, talking, and the sound of machinery. Given our location, this was profoundly weird. We camped in a tent because there were no huts nearby. Maybe there was another camp somewhere near us. We couldn't quite make out what was being said, but it was a human voice, no doubt about it. But nothing could really explain the sound of machinery. It sounded like an excavator or a tank, something big, powerful, and really not too far away. Combined with the sound of talking, we thought construction yard? But at the time of night, it's an unpopulated protective nature reserve. We get out of the tent. It was cold and pitch black. The campfire had some coals in it still glowing, and we took out our flashlights. My 2 buddies have always been a lot braver than I. The sound was coming from the north, maybe a half a kilometre away. We thought the construction might be going on behind a small hill some distance away. We couldn't see any lights or anything. We still could not make out what was being said. The speaking-like voice was monotonous, and it was impossible to even say which language was being used. It still sounded a lot like a person speaking, though. You may be aware of the sort of spooky phenomenon of hearing a human voice in static. Maybe you've used a blow dryer and been sure someone is talking. Turn it off, and it was just something the brain tried to interpret from the steady hum. Maybe it was sort of like that. It's hard to explain. The machinery-like sound continued. Not loud, but you could sort of make out the powerful engine, at times accelerating and adding power, and at times idle. My 2 friends resolved to go and find out what was going on. We put our warm clothes back on, donned boots, and I sat next to the dying fire, adding some more wood to it. I would stay at camp, while my buddies left to check out this mysterious construction yard in the middle of nowhere in the Lapland woods. So there I sat. The guys took their maps out, took a compass heading, and left, and I could hear them make their way through the forest. See the light from the flashlights, and they were gone. The weird sounds continued, unaltered. They were gone 15 minutes, then maybe 30, then the better part of an hour. It was odd. Judging by the volume of the sound, they should have reached it, checked it out, and been back already. I added more firewood, and tried to make out what the person talking was saying, but it was too tiny and obscure. The guys had been away for 2 hours at this point. I figured that they had stayed for coffee with the construction guys or something. Then the sound stopped. Just like that, it just ended. All at the same time. The engine sound and the voice both just quit. It was very silent. I waited for another 30 minutes, very worried now that something had happened, and maybe my friends were lost. Should I go and try and find them? I shouted their names several times and built the fire pretty big. I was scared witless when suddenly I saw the flashlights of my friends. Apparently they were returning in a hurry. The guys got back to the camp out of breath. They told me the following. They had followed the sound beyond the small ridge in the distance. There was nothing there, and it seemed like they were not getting any closer to the source. They had to stop every now and then, be quiet, and listen to see if they were able to walk towards it. They walked and stopped like this for some time, then realized they were not going to get any closer. The sounds did not change in volume at all. They decided to just go on a bit further several times, when suddenly the sound just stopped, like someone had pressed a button on a recording. They realized they had been gone for a long time. They were in the middle of the dark woods, alone. They reversed the heading and started back at a brisk pace. Eventually they saw my massive fire from the top of the hill and found their way back. The weird thing is, we seem to think the sound stopped at different times. They'd been gone 2.5 hours in total. They said the sound stopped at around the 1 hour 15 mark after they left. They then started to head back immediately. Return trip taking a bit longer, even though they kept a good pace. They apparently wandered around for a bit. For me, the sound stopped at the 2-hour mark, just 30 minutes before they returned. We did not sleep that night. Nothing more happened on the trip, and we never found out what the weird construction yard-like sounds were about. When we returned to the park visitor center some 5 days later, we asked around, but no one knew of any ongoing construction taking place in the whole national park area. It has been bugging me ever since. I do a fair amount of archery hunting when the weather permits, and trap rabbits about 3 times a year, although I do release them if they're pregnant. I used to be a vet technician and just can't do with baby bunnies. But I think the craziest thing that ever happened was when I was following some deer tracks. I had been tracking the herd for a few days, not planning on bagging one, just to observe. So I'm hauling around a tree stand and my tent and bear essentials. Before my pup got cancer, I would bring her, but she's in chemo, so it was a solo trip. I generally let her tell me when I wasn't noticing something, but without her, it got fairly creepy pretty quickly. I notice I'm losing the light and rub my face in frustration, and I'm suddenly waking up. I was just laying down, with my tent and everything set up, firewood under me, ouch, and a rip in my jacket. Nothing else to show for it, except that it was way darker than before. I checked my watch. I've got roughly 3 hours to sunrise. When/who set up my tent? They did it differently than I normally did. Okay, it's kinda just oilcloth and rope, and I travel light, but it wasn't in my usual formation. The zippers on my pack were all open. I was grasping my sheathed field blade in my left hand, and I'm right-handed. I don't know what happened. To this day, it unsettles me. One winter, when I was homeless in college, I had a mouse crawl into my tarp hideout as it was pouring buckets. It practically swam to get under the tarp, and it just sat there gasping, shivering. I gave it a cracker, and it sat with me. I eventually fell asleep for a few hours. When I woke, it was gone. But a little pile of grass and a twig with a berry on it, poisonous unfortunately, was where the mouse had been. Kinda always thought of it as a thank you. I've seen a lot of the usual stuff out in northwestern Canada. But the only thing that made me really think twice about going into the woods out there was not wanting to find a body. There are dozens, hundreds of unsolved missing person cases out there, many of them indigenous men and women, and white people as well. There are signs up everywhere with information about missing. I hope they're found and the families find some closure, but I dreaded being the one to come across a corpse. The other thing that made me think twice were the bullet holes everywhere. Blowing holes in highway signs is bad, but these guys would shoot up outhouses. Nothing like taking a dump and counting the bullet holes in front of your face. Canada has some stricter gun laws than the States, but people still make bad decisions. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I do hope, as always, that you enjoyed tonight's installment. If you did, feel free to press like and leave a comment down below with what you thought of the video. It's always nice and helps out my channel a lot. If you're new here, why not subscribe and hit the little bell icon to be notified every time I post. I do post every night, so it helps so that you don't miss those nightly spooks. If you want to share your story and have it read on the channel, you can send it to my email or post it to my Reddit. Either are fine. But please be sure to add plenty of grammar, good grammar, punctuation, paragraphing, and descriptions, as these are the main components to good stories and what I look out for when I select what I will read. But anyway, for now guys, I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.